Under Hargate Forest by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1: The Dare. The autumn air was crisp as Jake tightened the straps of his backpack, the fading sunlight casting long shadows through the trees of Hargate Forest. The others were waiting near the clearing, their faces a mix of excitement and unease. The entrance to the infamous WWII tunnels loomed just beyond the undergrowth, hidden from plain sight but etched into local lore as a place of mystery and danger. "You sure about this, Jake?" Mia asked, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Her voice wavered, a crack in her usually steady demeanor. "This isn't like sneaking into the old quarry." Jake grinned, his usual bravado on full display. "Come on, Mia, it's just some old tunnels. Besides, we've got Ben here to give us the history tour." Ben adjusted his thick glasses and cleared his throat. "It's not just tunnels. These were designed as a wartime operations room for General Montgomery in case the Germans invaded. They were abandoned after the war because, well, there were rumors." "Rumors of what?" Chloe, ever the skeptic, leaned against a tree, smirking. "Ghost Nazis?" "Not Nazis," Ben replied, his tone grave. "Workers went missing during construction. And after the war, soldiers stationed here claimed to hear voices and see things they couldn't explain. Some say the place is cursed." "Cursed?" Sam, the youngest of the group, glanced nervously at his sister Chloe. "Like haunted?" "Only one way to find out," Jake said, cutting off Ben. He stepped forward, brushing aside the overgrown brambles. Behind them was a rusted metal door, its paint peeling to reveal faint military markings. "Here it is, the entrance." Ellie, who had been silent up until now, stepped closer. Her pale face seemed to blend into the dimming light, her expression unreadable. "Do you know how to open it?" she asked softly. Jake brandished a crowbar from his pack, grinning. "Don't worry, I've got this covered." The others exchanged uneasy glances as Jake pried the door open with a groan of metal against metal. A musty, cold draft escaped from the dark void beyond, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The tunnel seemed to breathe, exhaling a warning. "This is a bad idea," Mia muttered. "Probably," Chloe quipped, already stepping inside. "But bad ideas are more fun." Jake turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. "Let's go, team. Stay close, and no chickening out." The tunnels were colder than any of them had anticipated, the air thick and damp. Their flashlights illuminated crumbling walls adorned with faded maps and cryptic military symbols. The deeper they went, the more the outside world seemed to fade, the silence swallowing them whole. Ben ran his fingers over a dusty map pinned to the wall. "These markings show evacuation points," he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. This wasn't just a headquarters. It was a fallback point. If things went south, this is where they would have made their last stand. "Cheery," Chloe muttered. Sam stuck close to Mia, his wide eyes darting around. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" Mia asked, her flashlight scanning the empty corridor. "Footsteps," he said, his voice trembling. "But not ours." Before she could respond, Jake called out from ahead. "Hey, check this out!" The group gathered around Jake, who stood before a rusted desk piled with yellowed papers and an old rotary phone. The phone's receiver hung loosely, as if someone had left in a hurry. "Cool, right?" Jake said, picking up one of the papers. "Looks like some kind of report." Ellie leaned in, her voice barely audible. "Put it down." "What's your problem?" Jake asked, his grin faltering for the first time. "It's just paper." "Just put it down," Ellie repeated, her tone sharper now. The atmosphere shifted. A faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, growing louder. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it natural. It was something in between, a sound that crawled under their skin. "Let's keep moving," Mia suggested, her voice tight. "We've seen enough." But as they turned to leave, they realized something was wrong. The tunnel they had come from was no longer there. In its place was another corridor, identical but different, as if the tunnels themselves had shifted. "Wait, this isn't right," Ben said, his voice rising in panic. "We came from that direction. I'm sure of it." "Relax," Jake said, though his confidence was visibly shaken. "We probably just took a wrong turn. Let's backtrack." They retraced their steps, or at least they thought they did. But the more they walked, the less the tunnels made sense. Hallways looped back on themselves, landmarks disappeared, and the air grew colder with every step. "Guys," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think we're lost." "No kidding," Chloe snapped. "Jake, this was your brilliant idea." What now? Before Jake could answer, a faint whisper echoed through the tunnel, a voice just on the edge of hearing. Did you hear that? Mia asked, her flashlight trembling in her hands. Probably just the wind, Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. It wasn't the wind, Ellie said, her eyes locked on the darkness ahead. It said, turn back. The group fell silent, the oppressive weight of the tunnels pressing down on them. For the first time, Jake's bravado faltered. Let's just keep moving, he said, and so they did, deeper into the dark, unknown. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Deep. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the tunnels, each step sharper and louder than it had any right to be. The group pressed on, their flashlights sweeping over walls that seemed to close in on them. The air grew heavier, thick with damp and something else, a sense of being watched. Mia couldn't shake the feeling crawling up her spine. This is insane, she muttered, glancing back. The tunnel behind them stretched into darkness, its silence almost mocking. We need to turn around and find the entrance. We're not lost, Jake insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. We just need to keep going. These tunnels can't go on forever. Ben hesitated, glancing at his watch. We've been down here for almost an hour. This place shouldn't be this big. The plans I've seen only showed a small network, barely enough for a single unit. Maybe they built more than they told people, Jake offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Chloe sighed, rubbing her arms. Well, congrats, Jake. You've officially taken us from bored teenagers to a missing persons case. Shut up, Chloe, Jake snapped. Nobody's missing, okay? Yet, as the group trudged forward, the whispering returned, soft, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from one direction. It surrounded them, weaving through the tunnels like smoke. Ben, Sam whispered, clutching his flashlight. What's that sound? Ben swallowed hard, scanning the darkness. It's probably just air currents. These old tunnels can make all kinds of weird noises. That doesn't sound like air, Ellie said quietly. She was walking at the back of the group, her flashlight aimed low, as if avoiding whatever might lurk in the shadows. It sounds like people. The group froze. Jake swung his flashlight in a slow arc. There's nobody here but us, he said, though his eyes darted nervously over the empty corridor. Let's keep moving. As they walked, the walls seemed to shift subtly, their surfaces now marked with deep scratches and smudges that hadn't been there before. Ben stopped suddenly, his flashlight fixed on a series of markings carved into the stone. Wait, he said, stepping closer. These are new. What do you mean, new? Mia asked, peering over his shoulder. These weren't here earlier. Look, he traced the markings with his fingers. They were crude and jagged, resembling tally marks. 1, 2, 14. He counted softly. It's a count, like someone was keeping track. Of what? Sam asked, his voice trembling. Ben didn't answer. Great, Chloe said, crossing her arms. Now we've got tally marks. What's next? Ghost Nazis actually showing up. Stop joking about it, Ellie said, her voice unusually firm. She stepped closer, her flashlight catching something just beyond the markings, a handprint smeared in dark red. That's not old. The group stared at the handprint, the silence between them thickening. It was fresh, too fresh for a place untouched for decades. Maybe it's just rust, Jake offered weakly. Do you even hear yourself? Chloe shot back. We need to get out of here, Mia said, her voice rising. This isn't funny anymore. But the tunnels had other plans. The group reached a junction where the tunnels split into 3 paths. Each one looked identical, stretching endlessly into darkness. Jake hesitated, then turned to Ben. Which way? Ben frowned, his flashlight darting between the passages. I don't know. We didn't come this far in the first place. None of this should even be here. Great, so we're officially lost, Chloe muttered. Shut up, Chloe, Jake snapped, but his voice cracked slightly. The confidence he wore like armor was quickly crumbling. Guys, Ellie said suddenly, her voice hushed. She pointed her flashlight at the ground. Where's Sam? The group froze, their heads whipping around. Sam, who had been right behind Mia, was gone. His flashlight lay on the ground, its beam casting long shadows against the tunnel walls. Sam, Mia shouted, her voice echoing in the stillness. Sam, where are you? The only reply was the faint hum of the tunnels. No footsteps, no whispers, just silence. Maybe he wandered back, Ben suggested, though his tone betrayed his fear. We need to. Shh, Ellie held up a hand, her head tilted slightly, her eyes narrowing at the tunnel ahead. Do you hear that? The group fell silent, straining their ears. Faintly from the darkness came the sound of breathing. It was shallow and quick, like someone or something was struggling to stay hidden. Sam? Jake called out, taking a cautious step forward. His flashlight beam quivered as it pierced the darkness. The breathing stopped. Mia grabbed Jake's arm. Don't. We need to stick together. Sam! Chloe yelled, her voice echoing down the tunnels. If you're messing with us. Before she could finish, a sharp noise cracked through the air, like metal scraping against stone. It reverberated through the tunnels, followed by a low, guttural whisper. Turn back. The words sent a chill down their spines, freezing them in place. The whisper didn't come from any one direction. It surrounded them, suffocating and omnipresent. Jake spun around, his voice shaking. We're leaving. Now. But Sam, Mia began, her voice breaking. We'll find him. Just move, Jake barked. As they hurried back the way they thought they had come, the tunnels seemed to stretch further, the walls shifting like a living labyrinth. The markings grew denser, the handprints more frequent, and the whispers louder. At times, they swore they saw movement in the corner of their vision, shadows darting just out of reach. The group stopped abruptly when they saw it. Sam's backpack lying in the middle of the tunnel. There was no sign of Sam, but a small, folded piece of paper lay on top of the bag. Jake knelt and picked it up, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. Written in shaky, hurried handwriting were the words, "It doesn't let you leave." A sharp clang echoed from deeper in the tunnels, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. The lights flickered, and the group stood frozen, terror seizing their limbs. The tunnels had claimed their first victim, and it wasn't finished. Chapter 3: The First Shadow. The group stood paralyzed, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The childlike laughter had faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The tunnels around them seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing in like a living force. Where is he? Mia's voice was frantic, her flashlight beams swinging wildly. Jake, where's Sam? We can't just leave him. Jake clenched the note in his hand, his jaw tight. We're not leaving him, but running around in circles isn't going to help. Circles? Chloe snapped, her eyes blazing with anger and fear. We've been going straight, or at least we thought we were. Don't you get it? This place isn't normal. Shut up, Jake barked, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. Everyone just shut up for a second. Ellie stood apart from the others, her flashlight aimed at the ground. She hadn't said a word since the laughter, her face pale and her hands trembling. She glanced up, her voice barely a whisper. It's watching us. What? Ben turned to her, his brow furrowing. Ellie's eyes darted to the shadows, where the faint outlines of handprints seemed to ripple, as if alive. Whatever's down here, it's watching us, and it's waiting. The group pressed on, this time walking in tense silence. The air felt heavier with each step, the darkness swallowing the tunnel ahead. Mia stayed close to Ben, her flashlight flickering in her hand. Do you think Sam's okay? She whispered. Ben hesitated, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack. I don't know, he admitted, but I don't think we're alone down here. Mia's face twisted with fear. You mean whoever took him? No, Ben said, glancing nervously at the walls. I mean something. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into a larger chamber. The ceiling arched high above, the walls lined with rusted equipment, desks, filing cabinets, and faded wartime maps pinned to corkboards. A single gas mask hung from a hook, its empty eyes staring down at them. This must have been the operations room, Ben said, his voice hushed. Where they coordinated, whatever they were planning. Does it matter? Chloe snapped, her gaze darting around the room. We need to get out of here. Jake ignored her, stepping toward the largest desk in the center of the room. An ancient typewriter sat atop it, the keys dust-covered but still intact. Papers were scattered across the surface, yellowed with age. What is this? He muttered, picking up one of the sheets. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. Containment protocols activated. Seal all exits. No one must leave. Ben's eyes widened as he peered over Jake's shoulder. This doesn't make sense. Containment? What were they trying to contain? Whatever it was, Ellie said, her voice low. They didn't succeed. As Jake rifled through the papers, Mia wandered toward a corner of the room where a dusty chalkboard stood. Drawn on its surface was a crude map of the tunnels, marked with red X's. Beneath it was a list of names written in neat military handwriting. Some of the names were crossed out. "Guys," Mia's voice trembled, "come look at this." The group gathered around her, their eyes scanning the names. Ben's flashlight illuminated the bottom of the list, where a fresh name had been scrawled in shaky, uneven letters. Sam. Chloe stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. "No, no, no, no. This can't be real." "It's real," Ellie said quietly, her gaze fixed on the chalkboard. "And it's not done with us." The sound of footsteps echoed from the tunnel they had come from. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. The group turned as one, their flashlights aimed at the corridor. The beam illuminated nothing but empty air, yet the footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second. "Run," Ellie said, her voice firm. "What?" Jake turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Run," she shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her toward another tunnel branching off the chamber. The group followed, their footsteps pounding against the cold stone floor. The sound of the pursuing footsteps seemed to follow them, growing louder and closer until it felt as though they were running in tandem with something unseen. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing to the point where they had to crouch. The walls were damp, the air cold and suffocating. Jake led the way, his flashlight flickering erratically. "Keep going," he shouted over his shoulder, though his voice was strained with fear. They reached a dead end, a blank stone wall with no exit. Jake swore under his breath, slamming his fist against the wall. "No, no, no! This isn't right." Behind them, the footsteps stopped. The group turned slowly, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The tunnel behind them was empty, but the air was thick with a presence they couldn't see. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It wasn't Sam. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly like embers in the dark, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "Turn back," it said, its voice a guttural rasp. The group froze, their terror rooting them in place. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. Then, in a single fluid motion, it lunged. Ellie screamed, grabbing a rusted pipe from the ground and swinging it at the creature. It didn't connect. The figure dissolved into shadow, reforming several feet away. "Go!" she shouted, shoving the others toward the tunnel. "Move!" They scrambled back the way they came, their breaths ragged and panicked. The creature didn't follow, but its laughter echoed around them, low and guttural. As they ran, Jake's flashlight caught something on the wall, a carving etched deep into the stone. It was a word, repeated over and over in jagged letters, "Forever." Chapter 4. Into the Abyss. The group's frantic footsteps echoed down the endless corridors as they fled from the chamber. The oppressive darkness pressed in closer now, heavier than before, as if the tunnels themselves were alive and watching. Their breathing was ragged, panic gripping their throats as they stumbled over unseen obstacles in their path. "We can't just keep running," Chloe shouted, her voice cracking. "We don't even know where we're going. What do you suggest?" Jake shot back, his words laced them more power. "We know," Mia replied, her voice barely audible. She kept her eyes fixed on Ellie, who led the group with a determined stride. Ellie seemed to know where she was going, or at least pretended to. In this place, confidence was as much a survival tool as light. The tunnels began to change again. The walls narrowed, forcing them to walk single file, and the air grew colder, their breath forming faint clouds in the dim light. Faint scratches marked the stone, and every so often they'd pass an old piece of equipment, broken helmets, rusted lanterns, and shattered rifles. The remnants of a forgotten war, left to decay in the bowels of the earth. "Do you feel that?" Chloe asked, her voice tight. She had taken up the rear, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. "It's like something's following us." Jake, walking just ahead of her, didn't turn around. "Don't think about it," he said gruffly. "Just keep moving." "I can't not think about it," Chloe snapped, her voice rising. "This whole place feels wrong. It's like the walls are watching us." "They are," Ellie said, not turning back. Her voice was calm, unnervingly so. "The tunnels are alive. They've been watching us since we got here." The group reached another junction, where the tunnel split into two paths. Both were identical, their yawning mouths disappearing into darkness. Ellie paused, staring at the two choices. "Which way?" Jake asked. his impatience bleeding into fear. Ellie didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head as if listening for something no one else could hear. Finally, she pointed to the left. "This way." "How do you know?" Chloe asked, narrowing her eyes. Ellie glanced back at her, her expression unreadable. "I don't, but standing here won't help." Reluctantly, they followed her down the left tunnel. The air grew heavier as they walked, the weight of the unseen pressing down on their shoulders. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces slick with moisture. The faint scent of decay lingered in the air, a reminder that they were far from the world above. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the previous rooms, its walls lined with rows of wooden shelves. Dusty files and crumbling papers filled the shelves, their surfaces coated in grime. Ben's flashlight illuminated a faded sign above the shelves. "Archives." His heart skipped a beat. "Wait," he said, stepping closer. "This could tell us something." Jake sighed. "We don't have time for a history lesson, Ben." "Do you have a better idea?" Ben shot back. "Because wandering aimlessly hasn't exactly worked for us so far." Ellie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He's right. If we can figure out what happened here, we might understand how to get out." Reluctantly, Jake joined the others as they began rifling through the files. The papers were brittle and yellowed, but some were still legible. Ben picked up a document stamped with the British military crest, his eyes scanning the faded text. "Containment Report No. 7, he read aloud. "Subject continues to exhibit anomalous behavior. Tunnels remain sealed per protocol. All personnel instructed to avoid direct interaction. Casualties, 4. Mia shivered. "Anomalous behavior? What does that mean?" "It means they were hiding something," Ben said, his voice tense. "Something they couldn't control." "Like that thing we saw?" Chloe asked. "Maybe," Ben replied. "Or maybe something worse." Jake pulled a file from the bottom shelf, shaking off a cloud of dust. He opened it, revealing a series of faded photographs. The images were grainy, but "We can get out. We just need to figure out the right way." "And how do you plan to do that?" Ellie asked, her tone cutting. "The tunnels aren't just shifting. They're alive. They're feeding on us, on our fear." Ben looked at her, his expression stricken. "You said your grandfather warned you about this place. Did anyone ever make it out?" Ellie hesitated, her grip tightening on the rusted pipe she still carried. "He told me that no one who went in ever came back the same, if they came back at all." Chloe threw her hands up in frustration. "So what? We just stay here until we die? That's your big plan?" "No," Ellie said firmly. "We keep moving. The tunnels want us to give up, to break, but there has to be a way out. There's always a way." The group reluctantly turned away from the door, their flashlights cutting through the suffocating darkness as they ventured deeper into the labyrinth. The air grew colder with each step, the walls slick with moisture and lined with more carvings, tally marks, names, and cryptic symbols they couldn't decipher. Jake stayed at the front, his jaw clenched. His bravado had cracked, replaced by a simmering desperation. "I'm not dying down here," he muttered under his breath. "I'm not." Behind him, Mia's flashlight flickered. She smacked it against her palm, her hands trembling. "These things were fresh when we came in. How long do you think the batteries will last?" Ellie didn't answer. Her own flashlight had begun to dim, the beam shrinking as the darkness pressed closer. The tunnel eventually widened into another chamber, this one larger and emptier than the others. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a fine layer of dust. At the center of the room stood a large circular mirror, its surface cracked and clouded, the edges framed in tarnished metal. "What the hell is that doing here?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who cares?" Jake said. "It's just a stupid mirror." Ellie stepped closer, her flashlight casting strange reflections across the cracked glass. "It's not just a mirror," she said softly. "It's another trick." Mia hesitated, her gaze locked on the glass. "I don't like this. It feels wrong." Chloe approached the mirror, her arms crossed. "It's just a mirror. What's the big—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening. Her reflection was wrong. The Chloe in the mirror wasn't standing still. It tilted its head, its lips curling into an unnatural grin. The real Chloe stumbled back, her breath hitching. "What the? Did you see that?" she gasped, pointing at the glass. It moved." Jake stepped forward, squinting at his own reflection. At first, it seemed normal, just his face staring back. But then slowly the reflection's eyes began to bleed black, the dark liquid dripping down its cheeks like ink. "Get away from it," Ellie said sharply, pulling him back. "It's not real." The whispers returned, louder this time, reverberating off the walls. The group huddled together, their flashlights flickering. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound, the words unintelligible yet suffocating. Ben clutched his head, his flashlight clattering to the ground. I can't think. Make it stop." "It's trying to get inside our heads," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Don't listen to it." "How are we supposed to not listen to it?" Chloe cried, her hands trembling. "It's everywhere." The mirror suddenly cracked further, a jagged web spreading across its surface. From the fractures, a thick black liquid began to seep, pooling on the floor and spreading toward the group. "Run!" Ellie shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her away. They bolted, leaving the mirror and its oozing darkness behind. The whispers followed them, growing louder with each step. The tunnels seemed to shift around them, the walls narrowing and twisting, forcing them into a single-file line. Jake led the way, his flashlight barely holding back the darkness. He stumbled over something and fell, his flashlight skittering across the ground. "Damn it!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. Ellie stopped, helping him up. "Are you okay?" "Fine," Jake snapped, grabbing his flashlight. He aimed it at the ground, freezing as the beam illuminated a pile of bones. The group gathered around, their faces pale as they stared at the remains. The bones were old, yellowed with age, but something about them felt wrong. The skull had deep scratches across its surface, rusting at it as if it had been clawed by something inhuman. "This place is a graveyard," Ben said, his voice shaking. "How many people have been trapped here?" "Too many," Ellie replied. Her gaze shifted to the wall behind the bones, where more carvings lined the surface. This time, they weren't tally marks. They were names, hundreds of them, each one etched with painstaking care. At the bottom of the list, a fresh name had been added, Sam. The whispers suddenly stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the walls. The group turned as one, their flashlights aimed at the darkness behind them. Something moved in the shadows. It wasn't the tall, thin figure they had seen before. It was larger, more monstrous, its form barely visible in the dim light. Glowing eyes stared at them from the darkness, unblinking and filled with hunger. "It's coming," Ellie said, her voice low. "Run." And this time, no one argued. Chapter 7. The Hunt Begins. The growl deepened, reverberating through the walls like a physical force, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. The creature's glowing eyes remained fixed on the group, unblinking and malevolent. It didn't charge. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to send a surge of terror through them. "Run!" Ellie shouted, her voice cutting through the paralysis that gripped them. Jake was the first to move, yanking Mia's arm and pulling her into a sprint. The others followed, their footsteps a chaotic rhythm as they fled deeper into the twisting tunnels. Behind them, the growl grew louder, accompanied by the heavy, deliberate thud of footsteps that echoed like drumbeats in the confined space. The tunnel branched into two paths ahead, the openings yawning like mouths waiting to swallow them whole. "Which way?" Jake yelled, his flashlight swinging wildly between the two options. Ellie didn't hesitate. "Left! Go left!" They veered left, their flashlights bouncing as they ran. The air seemed to thicken, slowing their movements as if the tunnels themselves were trying to trap them. The growling followed, closer now, the footsteps impossibly fast despite their deliberate cadence. Chloe glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. "It's gaining on us. Don't look back," Ellie shouted, her voice raw. "Just keep running." The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one larger and more decayed than the others. Broken furniture and shattered equipment littered the floor, and a rusted ladder led to a metal hatch in the ceiling. The air here was colder, biting at their skin like a predator's teeth. "Up the ladder," Jake commanded, pointing at the hatch. "Go now." Mia scrambled forward, gripping the ladder and climbing as fast as her shaking hands would allow. Chloe followed, her movements frantic. Ben hesitated, his flashlight scanning the room. "What are you waiting for?" Jake snapped, shoving him toward the ladder. "There's something written here," Ben muttered, his voice trembling. His flashlight illuminated the wall beside the ladder, where a phrase had been scratched into the stone with jagged, uneven lines. It sees you, it knows you, it becomes you. Ben, move! Jake roared, shoving him toward the ladder. Ben shook himself out of his trance and climbed. Ellie went next, her flashlight clipped to her belt as she ascended with steady determination. Jake was last, glancing back at the tunnel as the growling grew louder. Then it appeared. The creature was no longer a shadowy, indistinct figure. It had form now, twisted and grotesque, its limbs too long, its mouth impossibly wide. Its eyes burned with a sickly yellow light, and its body shifted unnaturally, as though it didn't belong in this world. Jake froze, his flashlight fixed on the creature. For a moment, it didn't move, its head tilting as if studying him. Then it grinned, a horrifying, deliberate motion that sent a cold wave of dread crashing over him. "Jake!" Ellie shouted from above. "Climb!" The creature lunged, and Jake scrambled up the ladder, its claws swiping inches from his feet. He reached the hatch and shoved it open, pulling himself through and slamming it shut behind him. The group collapsed on the floor of the new chamber, gasping for breath. The hatch rattled beneath them, but it held. For now. "Did you see it?" Chloe whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not human. It's not even close." "We know," Ellie said grimly, standing and inspecting their surroundings. The room they had climbed into was small and claustrophobic, its walls lined with dusty shelves. Old maps and rusted tools lay scattered across the floor, and a single dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly. Ben pointed to a desk in the corner, where a pile of papers lay undisturbed. "There might be something there," he said, his voice unsteady. Ellie moved to the desk, sifting through the papers. Most were too damaged to read, the ink smudged and the pages brittle with age. But one document caught her attention, a typewritten memo marked classified. She read aloud, Containment Protocol 12. Subjects display increased resistance to conventional methods of neutralization. Tunnels have been sealed indefinitely to prevent further incidents. All personnel are advised to avoid direct contact. "What does that mean?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "What subjects?" "They were experimenting on something," Ellie replied, her tone dark. "And whatever it was, it's still down here." "And now it's after us," Chloe muttered, hugging her knees. Jake stood, pacing the room. "So what do? We can't just sit here and wait for it to find us." "We need to keep moving," Ellie said. "There has to be a way out. These tunnels were designed to connect to the surface. If we find the right path." "What if there isn't a way out?" Ben interrupted, his voice rising. "What if it's like you said? What if the tunnels won't let us leave?" Ellie didn't answer. She turned back to the desk, her hands trembling slightly as she sifted through more papers. One caught her eye, a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed. It showed a network of tunnels with certain areas marked with X's. One path led to a circled area labeled Exit. "This might be it," she said, holding up the map. "If we can follow this." A loud bang echoed through the room, cutting her off. The hatch rattled violently, the sound reverberating through the confined space. Dust fell from the ceiling as the metal groaned under the force of repeated impacts. "It's trying to get in," Mia whispered, clutching Chloe's arm. Ellie folded the map and stuffed it into her pocket. "We have to go, now." The group moved quickly, exiting the chamber through a narrow passage that sloped downward. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light of their flashlights. The walls seemed to close in, the stone rough and uneven. As they descended, the growling faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic thudding. It wasn't coming from behind them, it was ahead. "What is that?" Chloe asked, her voice tight. Ellie's expression darkened. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we need to keep moving." They pressed on, the thudding growing louder with each step. The passage opened into another chamber, this one larger and more ominous than the others. At its center stood a massive metal door, its surface covered in more tally marks and scratches. Above it, carved into the stone, were the words, "The End and the Beginning." "What does that mean?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Ellie didn't answer. Her flashlight swept over the door, its beam illuminating a handprint in the center, fresh, dark, and glistening. "This is it," Ellie said quietly. "This is what the tunnels were built to contain." Behind them, the growling returned, louder and closer than before. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. The group turned as one, their flashlights trembling as they illuminated the tunnel they had just come from. The creature was there, its twisted form filling the passage. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and it began to move forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "We don't have a choice," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We go through the door." Jake hesitated, his flashlight fixed on the creature. "What if it's worse on the other side?" Ellie turned to him, her expression hard. "It can't be worse than this." The growling deepened, and the creature lunged. "Go!" Ellie shouted, shoving the door open. One by one, they ran through, plunging into the unknown. Chapter 8: The Other Side. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang, cutting off the growling and the creature's relentless pursuit. The group collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light around the new space. This chamber was different. The air was warmer, almost stifling, and the walls glowed faintly, illuminated by a dull red light that seemed to come from no discernible source. The floor beneath them was smooth, unnaturally so, as if polished by something more precise than human hands. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, clutching her flashlight as if it were a lifeline. Ellie stood slowly, her eyes scanning the chamber. It was massive, the ceiling stretching impossibly high into darkness. The walls were covered in symbols, circles, jagged lines, and spirals that seemed to shift when she looked directly at them. "It's wrong," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "This place isn't supposed to exist." Jake shone his flashlight toward the far end of the room, where something large loomed in the shadows. "What's that?" he asked, his voice tight. The group followed his beam, their breaths catching as the light revealed an enormous structure, a towering archway made of black stone, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols that lined the walls. The arch seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Ben stepped forward, his curiosity overtaking his fear. "It's a portal," he murmured, "or something like one." Ellie frowned. "A portal to what?" "I don't know," Ben admitted, his voice trembling. "But this is what they were trying to contain." Jake scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're saying the military built these tunnels just to hide a magic door?" "Do you have a better explanation?" Ben snapped. "Guys," Mia interrupted, her voice shaking. She pointed to the ground near the archway. "Look." The others turned their flashlights to where she was pointing. The ground was littered with bones, human and otherwise, scattered in a chaotic pattern. Some were ancient, yellowed with age, while others looked disturbingly fresh. "What the hell is this?" Chloe whispered, stepping back. "It's a graveyard," Ellie said quietly. "Everyone who came here, this is where they ended up." The faint hum of the archway grew louder, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in their bones. The symbols on its surface began to glow, the light intensifying with each passing second. "We shouldn't be here," Mia said, her voice barely audible. "We need to leave." Ellie turned to the group, her expression grim. "We don't have a choice. The creature is still out there, and this," she gestured to the archway, "this might be the only way out." Jake shook his head, his face pale. "You don't know that. For all we know, this thing could lead to somewhere worse." "Worse than being hunted and killed by that thing?" Ellie shot back. "Stop arguing," Chloe snapped. "We don't have time for this." The hum of the archway grew louder still, the light from its symbols casting shifting shadows across the chamber. The air grew thick with a strange energy, a palpable force that seemed to pull at them, urging them closer to the archway. Ben stepped toward it, his hand outstretched. I think it wants us to go through." Jake grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Are you insane? You don't know what's on the other side." "Neither do you," Ben shouted, yanking his arm free. "But staying here will kill us." A sudden, deafening roar echoed through the chamber, and the group spun around. The door they had come through began to buckle, the metal groaning under the force of repeated impacts. The creature was coming. Ellie turned to the group, her voice firm. "We go through the archway. Now." Mia hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "What if we can't come back?" Ellie placed a hand on her shoulder, her gaze steady. "We don't have a choice. Trust me." One by one, they stepped toward the archway, their flashlights flickering as the energy around them grew stronger. Ellie went first, her movements resolute. She paused at the edge, turning back to the group. "Whatever happens," she said, her voice steady, "we stick together." Without waiting for a response, she stepped through. The others followed, their fear outweighed by the growing threat behind them. Jake was the last to move, his flashlight fixed on the door as it finally gave way. The creature burst into the chamber, monstrous form illuminated by the pulsing light of the archway. It roared, its glowing eyes locking onto Jake as he stood frozen in terror. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, he turned and leapt through the archway. The world shifted. For a moment, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sense of direction or time. It was as if they were suspended in a void, weightless and untethered. Then, with a blinding flash, the world came rushing back. The group found themselves in a new space. The oppressive weight of the tunnels replaced by an open sky. The air was fresh, the scent of pine and damp earth filling their lungs. They stood in a clearing surrounded by tall trees, the moon casting a soft glow over the landscape. "We're outside," Mia said, her voice trembling with disbelief. Jake looked around, his breath coming in short gasps. "Is it over?" Ellie didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the ground beneath them, where faint symbols glowed faintly, etched into the earth in the same pattern as the archway. Ben knelt beside the symbols, his face pale. "It's not over," he whispered. "We didn't escape. We just moved." Ellie turned to the group, her expression grim. "The tunnels let us go, but they're not done with us." In the distance, a faint growl echoed through the forest. Chapter 9: The Forest Shadow. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound seem deafening. The group stood in the moonlit clearing, their breaths visible in the cool night air. The faint growl that had echoed through the trees lingered in their minds, an ominous reminder that their ordeal wasn't over. "What do you mean? It's not done with us?" Chloe demanded, her voice sharp as she stared at Ellie. Ellie's flashlight flickered, its beam barely illuminating the glowing symbols beneath their feet. "The tunnels didn't let us go because we escaped. They let us go because they wanted us here." "That doesn't make any sense," Jake snapped, pacing the edge of the clearing. "Why would it do that? Why not just kill us in there?" Ellie looked toward the forest, her expression unreadable. "Because it's not finished." Ben crouched beside the glowing symbols, running his fingers over the faint etchings in the dirt. "These markings, they're the same as the ones in the tunnels. They're connected somehow." "Connected to what?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "What is this place?" Ben shook his head, his fingers trembling. "I don't know, but it's not just the tunnels. It's the forest, too. Everything is part of it." A sudden rustling in the trees made the group jump, their flashlights swinging toward the sound. The undergrowth swayed gently, as if something large had passed through it. "Did you see that?" Mia whispered, stepping closer to Ellie. "Stay together," Ellie said firmly, gripping the rusted pipe she still carried. Her eyes scanned the darkness beyond the clearing. "Whatever it is, it's watching us." Jake stopped pacing, turning toward the group. "We can't just stand here and wait for it to find us. We need to move." "Move where?" Chloe snapped. "We have no idea where we are, and for all we know, there's more of those things out there." Ellie's gaze flicked to the trees, her expression grim. "We need to find higher ground. If we can get a better view, maybe we can figure out where we are." Reluctantly, the group followed Ellie into the forest, their flashlights casting long, shaky beams of light through the trees. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and fallen branches that snagged at their feet. The air felt heavy, the same oppressive weight they had felt in the tunnels now hanging over the forest. "What time do you think it is?" Mia asked quietly, breaking the silence. Ben glanced at his watch, then frowned. "That can't be right." "What?" Jake asked, his voice tense. Ben held up his watch, the glowing number stuck at 3:33 a.m. "It's been like this since we went through the archway. It's not moving." "That doesn't mean anything," Jake said quickly, though his tone betrayed his unease. "Maybe the battery died." "All our watches can't stop at the same time," Ben replied. "Something's wrong." Ellie didn't slow her pace, her flashlight scanning the dense undergrowth ahead. "Time doesn't work the same way here. The tunnels, whatever they are, they've twisted this place." They climbed steadily, the terrain becoming steeper as they ascended a small hill. The trees grew thicker, their gnarled branches intertwining above them to block out the moonlight. The only light came from their flickering flashlights, which seemed to grow dimmer with each passing minute. "What happens if our lights go out?" Chloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We don't let them, Ellie said firmly, though she didn't look back. As they reached the crest of the hill, the group stopped, their breath catching in their throats. Below them stretched an endless expanse of forest, the moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy. But in the distance, through a break in the trees, they saw it. The tunnels, the entrance they had entered hours, or was it days, before loomed in the moonlight, the rusted door half hidden by overgrown vegetation. Around it, the forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper, as if the trees themselves were guarding it. No, Mia whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. We were just there. We've been walking in circles, Jake muttered, his voice filled with frustration and fear. We haven't gone anywhere. It's not us, Ellie said quietly. The forest is leading us back. The growl returned, louder this time, coming from somewhere below the hill. The group turned, their flashlights swinging wildly as they scanned the darkness. The sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches grew closer, surrounding them. It's here, Chloe said, her voice trembling. We need to move, Ellie said, already heading down the hill in the opposite direction of the tunnels. Now, the group followed, their steps frantic and uneven as they stumbled through the undergrowth. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to come from all sides. What is it doing? Ben shouted, his voice breaking. Why doesn't it just attack us? It's toying with us, Ellie replied, her tone grim. It wants us to run. The forest grew darker, their flashlights barely piercing the gloom. The air became colder, each breath burning their lungs. The footsteps followed, unrelenting, but the creature remained hidden in the shadows. Mia tripped over a root, falling hard onto her hands and knees. Jake stopped, pulling her to her feet. Come on, we can't stop, he shouted. I can't, Mia gasped, tears streaming down her face. I can't keep running. Yes, you can, Ellie said, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. You don't have a choice. They burst into another clearing, their flashlights illuminating a small, crumbling structure in the center. It looked like an old bunker, its concrete walls cracked and covered in moss. A rusted metal door hung ajar, leading into the dark interior. Inside, Ellie commanded, ushering the group toward the bunker. Jake hesitated, his flashlight aimed at the dark opening. What if it's a trap? It's a chance, Ellie shot back. Do you want to stay out here? Jake didn't argue. One by one, they slipped inside, their flashlights casting eerie shadows across the decaying walls. The air was damp and cold, the faint smell of rot lingering in the enclosed space. Ellie closed the rusted door as best she could, leaning against it as she caught her breath. We need to stay quiet, she whispered. The group huddled together in the center of the room, their flashlights pointed at the door. The sound of footsteps continued outside, circling the bunker like a predator stalking its prey. What do we do if it gets in? Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Ellie tightened her grip on the rusted pipe, her expression hard. We fight. The growling stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The group held their breath, their flashlights trembling in their hands. For a moment, it seemed as though the creature had gone. Then, slowly, the door began to creak open. Chapter 10: The Doorway of Fear. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, each movement sending a high-pitched whine reverberating through the bunker. The group stood frozen, their flashlights trained on the widening gap. Beyond the rusted metal, the forest was shrouded in an unnatural darkness, impenetrable even to their beams of light. Close it, Chloe hissed, her voice breaking. Ellie held up a hand, motioning for silence. She stepped toward the door, the rusted pipe clutched tightly in her hands. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the beam illuminated something large and waiting just beyond the threshold. A shadow moved, then another. Back, Ellie commanded, slamming the door shut with a force that echoed through the bunker. Jake lunged forward, throwing his weight against the door. It's trying to get in, he shouted, bracing himself as the door buckled under an unseen force. The others rushed to help, pressing against the rusted metal as it shuddered violently. The sound of growling filled the air, low and guttural, vibrating through their chests. Something heavy slammed against the door, shaking it in its frame. It's too strong, Jake shouted, his voice straining with effort. Hold it, Ellie yelled, her voice sharp with determination. Ben's flashlight fell to the floor, casting wild shadows as it spun. In the flickering light, they saw the cracks in the concrete walls, small at first but spreading rapidly like spiderwebs. "It's breaking through," Chloe cried, her voice raw with panic. Ellie's mind raced. The bunker wouldn't hold much longer. They needed a way out, but the only exit was blocked by the creature, or creatures, outside. "Mia, the map!" Ellie barked, her eyes darting to the younger girl. "Did you grab the map from the tunnels?" Mia fumbled with her backpack, her hands trembling. She pulled out the crumpled map and handed it to Ellie, who spread it on the floor with frantic movements. The symbols on the map glowed faintly in the dim light, the lines shifting as if alive. "This isn't a normal map," Ellie muttered, her fingers tracing the glowing lines. "It's showing us something." "Like what?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. Ellie's eyes locked onto a symbol near the edge of the map, a spiral, similar to the carvings they'd seen in the tunnels. "A second door," she said, her voice filled with sudden hope. "There's another way out." A deafening crash interrupted her, and the group turned to see a crack splitting the bunker's ceiling. Dust and debris rained down, and the growling grew louder, as if the creature sensed their desperation. "We have to go now," Ellie shouted, folding the map and stuffing it into her pocket. "What about the door?" Jake asked, still bracing himself against it. Ellie glanced at the buckling metal, then back to the group. "It won't hold much longer. We need to run." Jake hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door. Another slam rattled the frame, and the growling turned into a guttural roar. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's go." Ellie led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as she followed the map's shifting lines. The others stayed close, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down on them like a physical force. "This way," Ellie called, turning sharply down a narrow corridor. The walls were slick with moisture, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. Behind them, the sound of shattering concrete echoed through the bunker. The creature had broken through. "It's coming!" Chloe shouted, her voice filled with terror. "Just keep moving," Ellie yelled, her flashlight bouncing as she ran. The corridor opened into another chamber, this one smaller and more decrepit than the others. At its center stood a circular platform, its surface covered in glowing symbols identical to those on the map. Above it, the ceiling was open, revealing a faint sliver of moonlight. "This is it," Ellie said, stopping abruptly. "What do we do?" Mia asked, clutching Ben's arm. Ellie studied the platform, her flashlight beam illuminating the symbols. "It's a doorway, like the archway in the tunnels." Jake frowned, his chest heaving. "How do we activate it?" Before Ellie could answer, the growling returned, louder and closer than ever. The group turned to see the shadows at the far end of the corridor twisting and writhing. The creature emerged, its glowing eyes locking onto them. "Do something," Chloe screamed. Ellie dropped her flashlight and knelt beside the platform, running her hands over the symbols. They pulsed faintly beneath her touch, growing brighter as if responding to her presence. "Hurry," Ben shouted, stepping in front of Ellie as the creature advanced. He held his flashlight like a weapon, though it trembled in his hands. The creature lunged, its claws raking across the walls as it closed the distance. Ellie pressed her hands to the center of the platform, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Stay back!" The platform symbols flared to life, their light filling the chamber with an intense glow. The creature roared, recoiling from the light as if in pain. "It's working," Jake yelled. "Keep going." Ellie focused on the symbols, her fingers tracing their shifting patterns. The platform began to hum, the sound vibrating through the floor as the light intensified. "Everyone, get on the platform," Ellie commanded. The group scrambled onto the glowing surface, their flashlights flickering as the chamber filled with light. The creature roared again, its body dissolving into shadow as it lunged for them one last time. With a blinding flash, the platform activated. The group felt a sudden weightlessness, their surroundings dissolving into pure light. The roar of the creature faded, replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no light, no sense of direction. Then, slowly, the world began to take shape around them. They found themselves standing in a different forest, the air warmer and the sky above clear and filled with stars. The oppressive weight of the tunnels was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Where are we? Mia asked, her voice trembling. Ellie looked around, her flashlight now steady in her hand. I don't know, she admitted, but we're not in the tunnels anymore. Ben knelt beside a nearby tree, his hand brushing against the ground. These markings, he said, pointing to faint symbols carved into the bark. They're the same as the ones in the tunnels. Jake let out a frustrated sigh. So what, we're still trapped? Ellie stood, her eyes scanning the dark forest. We're not out yet, but we're closer. In the distance, a faint growl echoed through the trees. Ellie tightened her grip on the rusted pipe. We keep moving. Chapter 11, Into the Unknown. The forest was deceptively serene. The air carried a faint hum, almost imperceptible, but it made their skin prickle. The stars above twinkled like silent witnesses, their cold light filtering through the dense canopy. The group moved cautiously, flashlights sweeping across the undergrowth as they navigated the uneven terrain. What if we're just going in circles again? Chloe asked, her voice strained. Her flashlight beam wavered, betraying the tremor in her hands. We're not, Ellie said firmly, though even she wasn't sure. She clutched the map, its glowing lines shifting slightly as though guiding them. This is different. The air, the sky, it's not the same forest. How do we even know if we're still on Earth? Ben muttered, his voice trembling. Jake groaned. Don't start with that sci-fi crap, Ben. We've got enough problems without. Quiet, Ellie snapped, holding up a hand. The group froze, their breaths catching in their throats. The faint growl they'd heard earlier returned, louder now, resonating through the trees. It seemed to come from all directions, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. What is it waiting for? Mia whispered, clutching Ben's arm. Ellie's jaw tightened. It's hurting us. Jake's eyes widened. Hurting us? Toward what? I don't know, Ellie admitted, her voice grim. But we need to stay ahead of it. They pressed on, their footsteps crunching softly against the forest floor. The map's glowing lines pulsed faintly, leading them toward a distant light that flickered through the trees like a mirage. Do you see that? Ben asked, squinting. There's something up ahead. Ellie nodded, quickening her pace. Stay close. We don't know what it is yet. The group emerged into another clearing, this one smaller and more unsettling than the last. At its center stood a circular stone altar, its surface carved with the same shifting symbols they'd seen in the tunnels. Around the altar, tall stone pillars rose like sentinels, their rough surfaces worn by time. What is this place? Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellie stepped closer to the altar, her flashlight illuminating the symbols. They glowed faintly, responding to her presence, their lines pulsing in rhythm with the hum that filled the air. It's another doorway, she said, like the platform in the bunker. Chloe crossed her arms, her voice sharp with disbelief. Another doorway? Where does this one lead? Because the last one didn't exactly take us to paradise. Ellie ignored her, studying the symbols. This is the only way forward. Jake approached the altar cautiously, his flashlight sweeping across the stone. So what do we do? Just stand here and hope it opens? No, Ellie said. We need to activate it, but it's different from the last one. She glanced at the map, its lines converging on the altar. There's something missing. A sudden rustling in the trees made the group tense. The growl returned, deeper and more menacing than before, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Whatever was stalking them was getting closer. It's here, Ben said, his voice trembling. We don't have time for this, Jake shouted, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Ellie, figure it out. Ellie moved quickly, her hands tracing the symbols on the altar. They grew brighter under her touch, their glow spreading to the pillars around them. But the light wasn't enough. The hum grew louder, but the doorway remained closed. It's not working, Ellie muttered, panic creeping into her voice. Why not? Mia cried. What's missing? Ellie's fingers hovered over the central symbol, a spiral etched deeply into the stone. Her eyes widened as realization struck. It needs something. A sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Jake asked, his voice rising. Ellie didn't answer. She turned to the group, her gaze lingering on each of them. The doorway needs energy. It has to take something to give us a way out. Chloe backed away, her eyes wide. You're not seriously suggesting? It doesn't mean someone has to die, Ellie said quickly. Just something. Something with enough energy to activate the symbols. Ben pulled the flashlight from his pocket, the beam flickering weakly. What about this? It's battery-powered. Maybe it's enough. Ellie hesitated, then nodded. It's worth a try. Ben placed the flashlight on the altar, its beam casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Ellie pressed her hand against the central symbol, her voice steady. Step back. The group moved away as the light from the flashlight began to dim, its energy draining into the altar. The symbols flared to life, their glow spreading to the pillars. The hum grew louder, the air vibrating with a palpable force. The growling returned, louder and closer than ever. The group turned to see the shadows between the trees shifting, writhing like living things. The creature stepped into the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on them. "It's too late," Mia screamed. "It's here." Ellie gripped the rusted pipe, stepping in front of the group. "Get on the altar," she shouted. "Now!" "What?" Jake yelled. "Are you insane? It's the only way." Ellie snapped. "The doorway needs all of us, trust me." Reluctantly, the group climbed onto the circular platform, their flashlights flickering as the air grew colder. The creature advanced, its monstrous form twisting and distorting in the glow of the altar's light. Ellie placed both hands on the central symbol, her voice firm. "Hold on to each other." The creature roared, lunging toward the altar as the symbols flared with blinding light. The air around them cracked like thunder, and the hum became a deafening roar. For a moment, everything went still. The creature froze mid-lunge, its form dissolving into shadow as the light consumed it. The forest faded, replaced by a swirling void of white and gold. The group clung to each other, their voices drowned out by the sound of the doorway's activation. The light grew brighter, filling their vision until there was nothing left but silence. When the light faded, they found themselves in another place entirely. The ground beneath them was smooth and cold, the air filled with a strange, sterile scent. The walls around them glowed faintly, their surfaces made of smooth, featureless material that defied explanation. "Where are we?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. Ellie looked around, her eyes narrowing. Not the tunnels, but not home either. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "Great, so now we're trapped somewhere else." "No," Ellie said, her voice steady. "This is different. The air, the walls, it's not hostile." Mia clutched Ellie's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What if it's just another trick?" Ellie didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the glowing walls where faint symbols began to appear, their lines shifting and pulsing. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "It's only just beginning." Chapter 12, The Liminal Zone. The strange, glowing walls pulsed with faint symbols, their patterns twisting and shifting like living things. The group stood huddled together, their breaths shallow as they tried to make sense of their new surroundings. The air was unnervingly still, devoid of the oppressive weight of the forest, but it carried an unsettling hum, low and constant, like a heartbeat. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Her wide eyes darted from one glowing wall to the next. "It feels wrong." "It's not the tunnels," Ellie said cautiously, stepping forward. Her flashlight flickered as she scanned the space. "But it's connected. I can feel it." Jake paced the smooth floor, his hands clenching and unclenching as he muttered under his breath. "We're just going from one trap to another. First the tunnels, then the forest, and now this." Ben knelt by the wall, running his fingers over the glowing symbols. They shifted beneath his touch, rearranging themselves into spirals and lines that pulsed faintly. "These are the same symbols from the tunnels," he said. "But they're more complete here, like this is where they came from. Maybe this is what the tunnels were protecting," Chloe said, her voice tight. She hugged her arms to her chest, her flashlight beam jittering as she tried to steady her hands. "Or hiding." Ellie turned her attention to the far end of the room, where the walls curved inward to form a narrow corridor. The pulsing light seemed to grow brighter there, beckoning them forward. "We need to keep moving," she said, her tone firm. "Standing here won't get us answers." "Answers to what?" Jake snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Why are we even here? What's the point of any of this?" Ellie turned to face him, her expression hard. "I don't know, but if we stop now, we'll never find out. So unless you have a better plan, shut up and follow me." Jake glared at her but didn't argue. With a reluctant nod, he motioned for the others to follow. The corridor stretched endlessly, its smooth walls glowing brighter the deeper they ventured. The hum grew louder, resonating in their bones, and the air seemed to shimmer faintly, distorting their surroundings. "Do you feel that?" Mia asked, clutching Ben's arm. It's alive." "It is alive," Ellie said quietly, her gaze fixed ahead. "This place is part of whatever created the tunnels. We're walking inside it." "Inside what?" Chloe asked, her voice sharp with fear. "A machine? A monster?" "Both," Ellie replied, "or neither. I think it's something older than we can understand." They reached a large chamber where the corridor opened into a vast, circular room. The floor was covered in the same glowing symbols, but these were larger, more intricate, forming concentric circles that radiated outward. In the center of the room stood a tall, crystalline structure, its surface translucent and shimmering with an inner light. "What is that?" Ben asked, stepping closer. Ellie's brow furrowed as she studied the structure. "It's a core, or a nexus. This is the center of whatever this place is." Jake scoffed, though his voice wavered. "And how does that help us? Do we just talk to it?" Ellie ignored him, approaching the crystalline structure cautiously. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as she reached out and placed her hand on its surface. The light inside the crystal flared, and a sudden jolt of energy shot through her, making her gasp. "Ellie!" Mia cried, rushing forward. "I'm fine," Ellie said, holding up a hand. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were wide with realization. It's showing me something." The light from the crystal pulsed, and the room around them seemed to shift. The walls became translucent, revealing images of the tunnels, the forest, and something else, an endless void filled with swirling shapes that defied comprehension. The group stared in awe and fear as the images flickered and changed. "What is this?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Ellie closed her eyes, her hand still pressed to the crystal. "It's a cycle," she said. "The tunnels, the forest, this place, it's all part of a loop, a trap." "A trap for what?" Ben asked. "For us," Ellie replied. "For anyone who comes here. It feeds on us, on our fear, our pain. It uses us to sustain itself." Mia stepped back, her face pale. "You're saying this thing is alive? That it's feeding on us?" Ellie nodded, her expression grim. "It's not just alive, it's ancient, older than the tunnels, older than anything we know. The people who built the tunnels tried to contain it, but they failed. It's been growing ever since." Jake clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "So what do we do? If this thing is as powerful as you're saying, how do we stop it?" Ellie opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto his. "We can't stop it, but we can escape it." "How?" Chloe demanded. "It's been controlling everything we've done since we got here. How do we break free from something that's everywhere?" Ellie turned back to the crystal, her hand trembling as she traced the glowing symbols on its surface. "The cycle isn't perfect," she said. "There are cracks, weak points. We just have to find one." "And if we don't?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellie's gaze hardened. "Then it keeps us. Forever." The chamber began to vibrate, the hum growing into a deafening roar. The light from the crystal flared brighter, and the images on the walls shifted violently, showing scenes of destruction, decay, and endless darkness. "It knows we're here," Ellie said, her voice urgent. "It's trying to stop us." "What do we do?" Ben asked, panic rising in his voice. Ellie pulled her hand away from the crystal, turning to face the group. "We run. We find the weak point and break through it. It's our only chance." "But where is it?" Mia cried. Ellie pointed to the far side of the chamber where another corridor opened into darkness. "There. That's where the cycle ends." The growling returned, louder and more menacing than ever. The shadows at the edge of the room began to twist and writhe, and the creature emerged, its glowing eyes fixed on them. "It's here," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "Run!" Ellie shouted, grabbing the map and leading the way toward the corridor. "Now!" The group didn't hesitate. They sprinted across the chamber, the hum of the crystal and the growling of the creature blending into a cacophony of sound. The light from the crystal dimmed as they ran, and the darkness closed in behind them. The corridor stretched endlessly, the walls shifting and pulsing as if alive. The growling grew louder, and the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, heavy, deliberate, and relentless. "It's catching up!" Jake shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Keep going!" Ellie yelled, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We're almost there." The corridor ended abruptly, opening into a narrow passage where a faint light flickered at the far end. The air grew colder, and the hum of the crystal faded, replaced by an eerie silence. "That's it," Ellie said, her breath coming in short gasps. The weak point. The growling behind them turned into a roar, and the group turned to see the creature barreling toward them, its monstrous form twisting and writhing. "Go!" Ellie shouted, shoving the others toward the light. "Now!" One by one, they ran toward the faint glow, their fear propelling them forward. Ellie was the last to move, her eyes fixed on the creature as it lunged toward her. With a final burst of strength, she leapt into the light. Chapter 13. Breaking the Cycle. Ellie's body tensed as she plunged into the light, the world around her dissolving into an overwhelming brightness. Her senses twisted, the hum of the tunnels replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment she felt as though she were suspended in nothingness, her body weightless and untethered. Then the light faded. She hit the ground hard, her knees buckling under the impact. Around her, the others lay sprawled across a surface that felt strange, cold and smooth like polished stone. The air was still, heavy with a faint metallic scent. Ellie pushed herself up, her head spinning. "Is everyone okay?" She called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. Mia groaned, sitting up slowly. I think so. Where are we?" Jake staggered to his feet, his flashlight flickering weakly in his hand. "This doesn't look like freedom." The space they were in was vast and open, but it felt claustrophobic. The floor stretched endlessly in all directions, its smooth surface reflecting the faint glow of the air itself. Above them, the sky, or what passed for it, was a swirling mass of gray and silver, churning slowly like a storm caught in slow motion. Ben approached Ellie, his face pale. "This doesn't make sense. We went through the weak point. We should be out." "We're not out," Ellie said, her voice steady. "Not yet." Chloe pointed toward the horizon where a faint structure loomed in the distance. It was a tower, impossibly tall and thin, its surface black and featureless. "What's that?" Ellie squinted, her heart sinking. "It's the center, the source of all this." "What do you mean, the source?" Jake demanded, his voice sharp. "You said the weak point would get us out." "I said it was our only chance," Ellie replied. This is where the cycle ends. If we want to escape, we have to destroy it." Mia clutched Ben's arm, her voice trembling. "Destroy what? That tower? How are we supposed to do that?" Ellie glanced at the map in her hand. Its lines glowed faintly, converging on the tower in the distance. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but that's where we need to go." The group began walking, their footsteps echoing across the endless expanse. The air grew colder as they approached the tower, and the faint hum they had left behind returned, growing louder with each step. As they drew closer, they noticed strange shapes scattered across the ground, objects that looked like relics from different times and places. An old rusted bicycle, a shattered smartphone, a tarnished helmet. Each item seemed out of place, as though plucked from another world and abandoned here. "What is all this?" Chloe asked, picking up a cracked pocket watch. Its face was frozen at 3:33. Ellie shook her head. "Fragments, echoes of people who've been trapped here before." Jake kicked a rusted can, his frustration bubbling over. "So what, we're just another set of victims? Another failed group of idiots stuck in this nightmare?" "No," Ellie said firmly. "We're going to end this." The tower loomed closer, its surface unnervingly smooth. The hum grew into a deep vibration, resonating through the ground and their bodies. As they approached, the faint glow of the air dimmed, plunging them into an oppressive twilight. The entrance to the tower was a tall, arched doorway, its frame lined with the same glowing symbols that had followed them since the tunnels. Ellie stopped in front of it, her hand tightening around the rusted pipe she still carried. "This is it," she said. "Whatever's controlling the cycle, it's inside." Mia's voice shook as she spoke. "And if we go in, we either end it," Ellie replied, "or it ends us." The group stepped through the doorway, their flashlights flickering as they entered the tower. The interior was dark, the walls lined with shifting symbols that pulsed faintly. The floor spiraled upward in a continuous slope, leading to a faint glow at the top. "We go up," Ellie said, her voice steady. They climbed in silence, the hum growing louder with every step. The air grew colder, and the symbols on the walls seemed to twist and writhe as they passed, forming shapes that looked almost like faces. "It's watching us," Ben whispered, his eyes darting to the walls. "Let it watch," Ellie said. "We're not stopping." At the top of the tower, the spiral opened into a circular chamber. In the center stood a massive crystalline structure, similar to the one they had seen before, but larger and more menacing. Its surface pulsed with a sickly yellow light, the symbols etched into it radiating an ominous energy. "This is it," Ellie said, her voice low. "The core." Jake approached it cautiously, his flashlight illuminating its jagged edges. "And how do we destroy it?" "Smash it with that pipe," Ellie shook her head. "It's not physical. It's connected to the cycle, to everything we've seen. We have to break its connection." "How?" Mia asked. Ellie held up the map, its glowing lines converging on the core. "With this." The core's light flared suddenly, and a deep, guttural roar echoed through the chamber. The air vibrated with a palpable force, and the walls began to shift, the symbols forming jagged, claw-like shapes. "It knows what we're doing," Ellie said, her voice steady. "Keep it distracted." "How are we supposed to distract that?" Chloe shouted as the roar grew louder. "Just do it," Ellie yelled, her focus on the map. Jake, Ben, and Chloe stepped forward, their flashlights aimed at the core. The light seemed to irritate it, the symbols on its surface flickering wildly. The roar turned into a deafening screech, and shadowy tendrils erupted from the walls, lashing out at the group. Ellie knelt by the core, the map glowing brighter in her hands. She pressed it against the crystal, her fingers tracing the lines as they pulsed with energy. "This is it," she whispered. "This is how we end it." The core's light flared, blinding and oppressive. The tendrils lashed wildly, slamming into the walls and floor. Mia screamed as one of them wrapped around her leg, pulling her toward the shadows. "No." Ben shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. Ellie's hands trembled as she pressed the map harder against the core. The light grew brighter, the symbols on the map and the crystal merging into one. The hum became a deafening roar, and the ground beneath them began to shake. The core let out one final piercing scream as the light consumed it. The room exploded in a blinding flash, the symbols disintegrating into ash. The roar faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When the light dimmed, the core was gone. The tower walls were smooth and featureless, the oppressive hum finally silenced. "We did it," Ellie said, her voice barely audible. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. For the first time since they'd entered the tunnels, the air felt light, free. "What happens now?" Mia asked. Ellie looked toward the now empty doorway, where a faint light shone through. "We leave." As they stepped through the doorway, the tower dissolved behind them, fading into nothingness. The group found themselves standing in a familiar place, Hargate Forest, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The tunnels were gone, replaced by overgrown grass and trees. "We're back," Ben whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Jake laughed, though it was shaky and tinged with relief. "We made it." Ellie looked at the horizon, her expression unreadable. "The cycle's broken, but it's not gone. It's just sleeping." "And if it wakes up?" Chloe asked. Ellie tightened her grip on the rusted pipe. "Then we make sure it never starts again."